Hi everyone, my name is Nadine and I'm the Associate Director of GSEP Career Services. Today we'll be talking about how to prepare and practice for your job interviews. Whether you're applying to practicum or associate positions, this presentation will provide you with tips, strategies, and resources to bring your best self to the interview. So this is our agenda for the presentation. It's broken down into 3 sections. So we'll cover tips and strategies for before, during, and after the interview. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We'll first take a moment to reflect. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable would you say you are with interviewing? 1 being not comfortable at all, and 10 being it's a piece of cake. If you find yourself on the higher end of the spectrum, then that's awesome. Hopefully this presentation will just offer some reminders and maybe even some new ideas for you. But if you're finding yourself on the lower end of the spectrum, I just want to take a moment to normalize that. Interviewing can be intimidating and you're definitely not alone. This presentation will give you some useful strategies that will hopefully ease your nerves. So let's get started with some things you can do to prepare yourself for the interview. Number 1, and probably the most important, do your research. So you really want to review the organization's website and become very familiar with who they are and what they do. Look up things like their mission and their values, be aware of their company culture, their expectations, and the overall philosophy so that it's evident during your interview that you did your homework about them. Another thing that you should definitely do is review the job description so that you can highlight the skills that you have that they are actually asking for. Also, it would probably help to know who your interviewers are. So if you can, look them up on LinkedIn or on Google, become familiar with who they are, because that way you'll be going in prepared since you'll know who you're talking to. And no, don't worry, it's not unusual or odd to look into these people ahead of time. If anything, it shows that you're doing your research. Also, always have questions ready to ask. You're interviewing them for right fit as well, so the interview is going both ways. Your research will really help you come up with a list of questions, and this is going to show the employer that you're informed and that you're prepared, which are 2 things that they really like to see. So I would suggest to try to have at least 3 in-depth questions, if not more, and be sure to ask questions that you wouldn't be able to find online on their website. As far as what to ask, think about your priorities when it comes to your work and your professional growth. Make a list of those priorities and then fill in questions for each. So some examples of questions that you can ask for a clinical type of position might be, what type of training will I receive? What is the supervision style here, group or individual? What is your agency or organization's ideal candidate for this position? That's a pretty common one. Another question could be, how do you balance in-person work and telehealth if that's something that they provide? And so on. So those are just some ideas to get you going, but I would really encourage you to think of unique questions that really reflect what's important to you. So before your interview, it'll be important to prep and practice your personal pitch. This is a quick summary of who you are. It's your experience, your skills, and your qualifications, and it can be broken down into 3 easy components. You want to start off by introducing yourself, so just sharing your name and what school you're with if it's a practicum site interview. Then you want to share some relevant information about your achievements or skills. So this could include things like your recent training, your work history, your relevant experience, and that could be volunteer experience or community involvement, maybe research or something else that's unique. You can also talk about any other relevant skills, like if you're bilingual, if you speak multiple languages, etc. Then you want to close that section by expressing your career goals and your fit for the position. So think of the question, why do I want to do my practicum here specifically? Or why do I want to work as an associate here specifically? So think about how this place fits with who you are and what you're looking for, and what do you like about their mission and how would you contribute to it? How would they also contribute to your growth and development as a therapist? So here's a breakdown of the components in more detail. I would really encourage you to come back to this or pause the presentation at this time in order to take some time to reflect on these points and draft your own personal pitch. So everyone is probably used to being in a virtual environment by now, but do keep in mind that if you have a virtual interview, you should always practice with the technology before it starts. You want to make sure that you pick a quiet location with a neutral background, somewhere that's clutter-free and quiet. Virtual backgrounds are also an option, and probably a good one. And lastly, pick a place that's well lit. Make sure the light source is not coming from behind you, because this will just make you look like a shadow. But the best thing to do is to put a light in front of you, but somewhere behind the camera, and test the speakers and microphone ahead of time to ensure that you can hear them and that they can hear you. So all of the information on the previous slides, like doing your research, coming up with questions to ask, etc., should help you feel prepared and help manage some of that anxiety. But in addition to those things, here are some other quick tips. So firstly, reframe the experience. Like I said before, you're interviewing them as well. You're not the only one being interviewed here. So remember that this is also your opportunity to see if they're a good fit for you, and you do have the option to pass on them if they aren't. So take some of that power back. If your interview is in person, make sure to map it ahead of time. Find out where the parking is, where the building is, so that you're not rushing at the last minute. I can share from my personal experience when I applied to practicum many years ago. I actually was late to my group interview because I didn't know where parking was, nor where the building was, because the site had multiple buildings. So make sure you don't make that same mistake. Another quick tip to maybe ease some of that anxiety, plan that outfit ahead of time, and yes, make sure to dress professionally. It is an interview, even if it's for practicum. Another thought is to engage in some positive self-talk and challenge those fears. Your perception of the interview can really impact your feelings about it. So identify whatever negative thoughts you might have about the interview. For example, I'm not experienced enough for this role, and challenge it. So for example, I have valuable experience from my time working at X. Give yourself some affirmations. You wouldn't have been invited to the interview if they didn't think you might be a right fit for the role. So if they already considered you eligible enough to have called you for an interview, you should believe that too. So canceling. You don't always have to cancel an interview at the last minute if you've already gotten another offer. Unless you've actually landed your absolute dream job, it doesn't hurt to go through with that interview anyway. So if anything, it actually provides you with more experience. It can also help you form a relationship with someone in the field, even if you don't take that position. Networking is important, and it's never too early to start. As far as communication goes, you want to make sure that you promptly respond to those emails and that you maintain open communication if anything changes. So keep them informed if something comes up, if you need to reschedule, if you don't want to have the interview anymore. The worst thing you can do is ghost, so just make sure you don't do that. So now during the interview, we're going to focus on some tips for that time. The first thing you want to make sure you do is turn your phone off or put it on silent. You don't want it to buzz during an interview. Even in a virtual interview, I can't tell you how many times I've been in Zoom actually interviewing people and I've heard their phones buzz. You also want to come prepared. So have a copy of your resume nearby to jog your memory. Use it as a cheat sheet or even take notes on it. And also remember, bring that list of questions that you developed before the interview. You want to be mindful of eye contact and body language as well. So things like clenched fists, bouncing your legs, crossing your arms, playing with your hair, fiddling with things, glancing around the room. These are all things that can convey nerves or disinterest. So with practice, those improve. So let's talk about some common questions that you might be asked and some strategies for how to answer them. So tell me about yourself. This is your personal pitch. That's where this comes in. So who are you and what you do? What is your goal? What are your relevant qualifications? And why are you a good fit for this organization or agency? We won't go through all the components of the personal pitch again since we already did that earlier. But like I said, please feel free to go back, pause, and spend more time developing your answer to this question. It can not only help you in interviews, but also for networking. Another common question is, what do you know about our organization or agency? Why are you interested in working here? So whether you're applying to practicum or an associate position, this is where your research will again come in handy. You want to demonstrate a working knowledge of who they are and give specific reasons and examples for when they ask you why you're interested in them. So some examples could be maybe the population that they work with, maybe their theoretical approach, maybe their supervision and training is exactly what you're looking for. So let's review a couple more questions. Another one is, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Sometimes they call weaknesses areas for growth, by the way. So I would try to be ready with 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses or areas for growth. Typically, it's really easy to think of strengths, but I would try to think of strengths that are directly relevant to the position that you're applying to or the skills that they're looking for. But as for weaknesses or areas for growth, your answer should contain 2 parts. The first part is the actual weakness. So you want to briefly describe something real that wouldn't be a major hindrance to the job. Pick something minor, fixable, and acceptable, and you want to speak about it in a neutral way. Don't go into too much detail about it or sound defensive or overly negative. The second part of your answer is going to be about how you're already working on it. So this is really a critical component. You want to discuss your proactive efforts to improve because this shows that you're self-aware, you have the drive to be your best, and that this so-called weakness is not going to slow you down in the job. So some interviewers might ask you what your career goals are, and this could sound like, where do you want to be 5 years from now? Or what is your long-term goal as a therapist? I know I was asked that during my associate position interview. So you don't need to be super detailed or provide a perfect answer because you might not know yet, and that's okay. But you do want to demonstrate that you've actually thought about your future, and the key is to show where this position might fit in. So how does this position or organization play a part in your career goals, and why them and not anybody else? Interviewers also love asking what we call our behavioral questions. So behavioral questions are aimed at asking for a scenario or a story or an example of an actual experience that you had. The employer is trying to learn about your skills and how you use them. So there's a difference between telling somebody that you can do something or that you have a skill versus showing them how you've actually done something or how you've actually used that skill. And that's what the behavioral question is trying to get at. So these types of questions are really common because they can show rather than just tell. So you'll know it's a behavioral question because it'll start with something like one of these things on the screen. The best way to answer behavioral questions is to use the STAR method. This stands for situation, task, action, and result. So S standing for situation. What was the context or problem? T for task means what was the goal at hand. A for action means what did you do to reach the goal or address the situation. And R for result is simply what was the outcome. So use this formula as a template for every behavioral question you're asked. It's really helpful for conveying specific and concrete examples of your skills. And remember that you're telling a story that highlights your capabilities. So this is your template for that. So this is an example of how you can actually use the STAR method to answer a behavioral question. We'll pause here to give you some time to read through. So you can see that the answer begins with explaining the situation. Once that's described, the next part of the answer clearly conveys the goal at hand and the action that the person took. The answer then closes with the result of the action. So this is really a gold standard way to answer a behavioral question. Sometimes when people are asked behavioral questions, they might think that they don't have a scenario or a story or an example to share because it's never happened to them. But if that's the case for you, simply think of how would I act in this situation if it happened to me? What would I do? And you can still use the STAR template to answer the behavioral question. So be sure to log into Handshake to see some sample interview questions for both practicum positions and for associateship positions. You can find all these sample questions in Handshake's resource library, and feel free to pause here to find them. After the interview. You've had your interview, you can breathe a sigh of relief now and really forget about everything until they call you again. But actually, not quite. Always remember to follow up with your interview and send a thank you email at least within the first 24 hours. This will help them remember you and you'll leave a lasting positive impression. Begin your email by thanking them for their time and telling them that you enjoyed meeting with them. Then include something specific that you liked about your discussion with them or something you learned about their site or the position. Prepare a draft of your message before your interview. That way you can quickly edit it and send it off once your interview is over. This will make it easier to get your email out quickly, and it will also help you stand out. So let's say you got the offer and you're leaning towards accepting it. It's totally okay to take your time to consider the offer, but just make sure to at least acknowledge the receipt of the email or voicemail when they called you or reached out to offer you that position. Don't just ignore it as you're deciding to accept or decline. When you do acknowledge receipt, make sure that you express your thanks and let them know that you'll take some time to consider it, and then make sure to stick to whatever timeline that you both agree on to give your final answer. In the meantime, this is your chance to ask any lingering questions that might help you make that decision. Once accepting, include a thank you and confirm next steps. Now let's consider the opposite scenario. You got an offer, but it wasn't the right fit, and you've decided that you actually don't want the position. Make sure that you show appreciation and express thanks, and decline with a brief reason, no need for extra detail. Wish them well and stay in touch. You can say something like, "It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and I hope we cross paths in the future." You can add them on LinkedIn to maintain that connection. And remember, it's never too early to start building your professional network within the mental health field. Down the line, this relationship might actually be helpful for you. If you want to practice, or you need help coming up with a strategy, or maybe you just want some support through your interview process, you can always schedule an appointment with Career Services via Handshake. And don't forget to look at the resource library where you can find a list of those sample questions to practice with.